The garage door was still going up when David Camm saw his wife. The scene was devastating. And her shoes, that was the part that didn't make sense. They weren't on her feet. They were sitting on the roof of her car, side by side, perfectly straight, like someone had taken the time to place them there. David and Kim Camm had built a life most people would call the dream. They met back in the mid-1980s, in the same small Indiana town where they'd both grown up. David had been married once before, briefly when he was young. That marriage didn't last, but when he met Kim, everyone around them said it was different. They got married in 1989. That same year, David applied to become an Indiana State Trooper. He didn't just get accepted. He did well enough to be chosen for a special emergency response unit, the kind reserved for officers other officers trusted. 2 kids came next. Bradley, born in 1993, Jill, born 2 years later. A house went up on land that had been in David's own family for generations, on a road that carried his family's name. Kim built a career of her own too, working her way up at an insurance company, well liked by everyone she worked with. David eventually left the state police to work for his uncle's business, selling basement waterproofing. Better hours, more time at home. He coached his son's teams on the weekends. To their friends, their families, their neighbors, the Camms looked like a family that had it figured out. On Thursday, September 28, 2000, nothing about the day stood out. Kim took the kids to swim practice and dance class. David played his usual Thursday night basketball game at the church gym down the road, the same game he played almost every week with the same group of friends. Just an average Thursday night, in an average American town, until he pulled into his driveway and walked into a nightmare. Kim, on the ground, not moving. He ran toward her, then looked past her, into the car. Both kids were still inside, buckled into their seats. Jill wasn't moving, but Bradley still felt warm. David pulled his son out of the car, right there in the garage. He'd been trained for this, 10 years on the force. He knew CPR. He tried anyway. It didn't work. All 3 of them, his wife, his son, his daughter, were gone. What happened next is one of the most gutting 911 calls ever recorded. A man who used to work dispatch himself, now begging his own former co-workers to send help. And for a moment, just a moment, he was put on hold. Police arrived to a scene that made even seasoned investigators go quiet. Kim's shoes on the roof of the car, nobody could explain that. Not then, not for years. And a few feet away near the vehicle lay a gray sweatshirt. It wasn't David's, it wasn't Kim's. It looked like something dropped in a hurry, by someone who didn't belong in that garage at all. Whoever it belonged to had left it behind without seeming to notice, or without caring. So, who did it belong to? Investigators had one obvious place to start: the husband. The one person in that house who wasn't lying on the floor. Some of the officers on scene that night had known David for years. A few even called him a friend. But David had an alibi that should have ended the conversation before it began. 11 men, 11 witnesses. Every single one of them swore David was at that church gym the entire time his family was being targeted across town. Not just for part of the evening, the entire time, from the opening tip to the final buzzer. 11 people, same story, no cracks. But in a case this clean, the state was already looking for a crack. Because 3 days later, forensic technicians went back through David's clothing from that night. The same shirt he wore to the game, the same shirt he wore when he pulled his son from that car. And on it, they found something. Tiny, almost invisible. 8 small specks of blood. 8 dots smaller than a pencil eraser. That was it. That was all it took. Within 72 hours of finding his family dead, David Camm, the man who called for help, who fought to save his own son, was arrested for their murders. 11 witnesses said he was somewhere else. 8 tiny drops of blood said otherwise. And somebody, somewhere, was about to have to decide which one was telling the truth. News of the arrest spread through the small town almost overnight. People who had grown up with David, who had known his family for years, suddenly found themselves choosing sides in a case that hadn't even gone to trial yet. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Neighbors who once waved to David across the yard now crossed the street to avoid him. In a town that small, there was no such thing as staying out of it. prosecutors had a theory, a wild one. They said David left his basketball game in the middle of play, drove home, carried out the devastating act, cleaned himself up, and drove back, all without a single one of his 11 teammates noticing he was gone. According to their timeline, he would have had less than 20 minutes to do all of it and return looking completely normal. No weapon was ever found. No fingerprints tied him to the scene. Nothing placed him in that garage. Nothing except 8 tiny dots of blood. So, the state built their entire case around those 8 dots. The man they brought in to explain that blood wasn't some outside neutral scientist. He worked directly under the county prosecutor, brought in special for this case. He took the stand and told the jury those specks were something called high-velocity spatter. In plain words, impact residue that is cast back the instant a weapon is discharged. He claimed the pattern could only land on someone's shirt if they were standing directly over the scene during the event. To the jury, it sounded like science, certain, undeniable. He spoke with total confidence, like a man who had done this 100 times before. But David's defense brought their own expert, and he had a completely different explanation for those same 8 dots. He said David pulled his son's body out of that car with his bare hands, and right next to Bradley sat Jill, who had also passed. The defense argued David's shirt simply brushed against her as he reached in, that the blood didn't come from a gun, it came from contact, from a father trying to save his son. Same 8 dots. 2 completely different stories. One expert said, "This proves he did it." The other said, "This proves he didn't." And now, a jury of regular people had to pick which scientist to believe, with nothing else to go on. With the forensics reduced to a coin flip, the state realized the science wouldn't be enough on its own. They needed something bigger, something that didn't require a microscope, so they stopped fighting the evidence and started fighting who David was. One by one, 12 different women were called to the stand. Each one talked about some kind of relationship with David over the years. Some said he'd flirted with them. Some said more happened. None of it had anything to do with September 28th. None of it placed him at that house. None of it explained the murders. But that was never really the point. 12 women, one after another, for days. By the time the last one stepped down, the jury wasn't thinking about blood spatter anymore. They were thinking about the kind of man David Camm was. His 11 basketball witnesses still testified. Every one of them stayed exactly the same. No one changed a word. No one cracked under pressure. Some of them had known David for years. They sat in that witness box and said the same thing they'd said to police on the very first night. It didn't matter anymore. By the time closing arguments came around, the trial wasn't really about where David was that night. It was about whether they liked him enough to believe him. They didn't. The courtroom itself had become a kind of theater by then. Cameras lined the back wall. Every seat was filled, day after day, week after week, as the trial stretched on for nearly 2 months. David sat through all of it, forced to listen to his own family described in autopsy terms, forced to watch strangers decide whether the worst night of his life made him a killer or a victim. On March 17, 2002, the jury came back. Guilty. All 3 counts. David Camm was sentenced to 195 years in prison, but the true punishment had already begun. He hadn't even been allowed to bury his family. When the funeral finally came, David wasn't free to attend it as any other father would. He was brought in after midnight, once the room was empty, handcuffed, surrounded by 15 officers. He was given exactly 5 minutes with his wife and children before they were gone forever. 5 minutes. That was all the system allowed him. He walked out of that room in chains, convicted of murdering the 3 people he loved most, on evidence that even the experts couldn't agree on. It was about 12 women and a jury, deciding they already knew who David Camm was. Inside prison, David held on to one belief for months, that someone, somewhere, would realize the mistake and come let him out. Every time he heard footsteps outside his cell, every time a guard's keys rattled near his door, some part of him braced for the moment someone would tell him it was over, that they'd finally figured it out. That moment never came. Eventually, he stopped waiting for it and simply tried to survive one day at a time. But somewhere in that courtroom, something had gone wrong, something no one had caught yet, and it wouldn't stay buried for long. 2 years into his sentence, David Camm won. In August of 2004, an appeals court threw out his conviction. The judges said something simple but devastating. Those 12 women should never have taken the stand. Their testimony didn't prove he committed a crime. It only made the jury dislike him. A trial built on character instead of proof. That's what the court called it. For David, the ruling was both a victory and a gut punch. It confirmed something he'd been screaming from the very beginning, that the state never actually had the evidence to convict him. But it also meant 2 years of his life were gone over a mistake the system had made, not him. But winning an appeal doesn't open a cell door. David wasn't free. He was just waiting for round 2. Another prosecutor took over the case, promising the family and the public a fresh look, a fresh set of eyes on all the evidence. His defense team knew they couldn't survive another trial the same way. This time, they went looking for something the state had never really explained, that gray sweatshirt from the garage floor. Investigators had it in evidence since the very first night. Nobody in the Camm family recognized it. It didn't belong in that house. And yet, somehow, it barely came up at the first trial. David's lawyers asked why. The answer they got back was simple. The sweatshirt had DNA on it. That DNA had already been run through the National Criminal Database. No match came back. Except, that wasn't true. When David's team dug deeper, they found the DNA was never actually run through that database. Not once. The state had simply told the defense it had been checked. For years, that sweatshirt sat untouched in an evidence room, while a lie about it sat just as untouched in the case file. So, the defense demanded a real test. Weeks went by while the sample sat in a lab, waiting its turn. For David, still sitting in a cell with nothing but time, those weeks must have felt endless. He'd already learned the hard way that even solid evidence didn't guarantee anything in this case. This time, it happened. And when investigators finally looked closely at that sweatshirt, they noticed something stitched inside the collar. A word. Backbone. They ran the DNA, and they ran that name. The database didn't just find a match. It found a man whose own prison nickname was Backbone. His name was Charles Boney, and his record read like a warning label. Armed robbery. Accused of trying to grab women off the street at gunpoint. Not just once, but on repeated occasions. And one detail that made investigators go completely silent. He had an obsession with women's shoes. It was so well known, so consistent across his past crimes, that other officers had given him a second nickname entirely, the Shoe Bandit. For years, nobody could explain why Kim's shoes had been taken off her feet and placed so carefully on the roof of her own car. It never fit David. It never fit anything about that family. It fit Charles Boney perfectly. His DNA was on a sweatshirt found feet from the bodies. His nickname was stitched inside the collar. His signature obsession explained the one detail of the crime scene that had haunted investigators from day one. Police brought him in, and Charles Boney denied all of it. He claimed he'd never met David Camm. He claimed he'd never been anywhere near that house. He sat across from the detectives and simply said, "No, no, and no, again." He even told them he'd given the sweatshirt away years earlier, dropped it in a donation box, and had no idea how it ended up at a murder scene. It should have been the moment the state admitted they made a mistake, but they didn't. If Boney's DNA was on the sweatshirt, and his obsession explained the shoes, why was David Camm still behind bars? Because the state was about to do something even more desperate. Real quick, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. While you're down there, tell me who you think the real killer is at this point. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time, because what happens next gets even worse. 2 weeks after Boney sat across from detectives and said, "No, no, and no again," a palm print came back from the side of Kim's car. It was his. He could no longer say he was never there. So, his story changed. This time, Boney admitted he knew David. He said they'd played pickup basketball together. He said David asked him for a gun, one that couldn't be traced back to anyone. He said he sold it to him, and then he claimed he stood outside that garage and watched David commit the murders himself. But the state didn't use this confession to free David. They used it to trap him. Prosecutors built a brand new theory. Not one killer, two. David and Boney, partners in the same crime, each one covering for the other. The man whose DNA, nickname, and fetish lined up perfectly with the crime scene was no longer the sole suspect. He was now David's alleged accomplice. But to make a jury believe a father would partner with a stranger to kill his own children, the state needed a motive. So they found one. Prosecutors introduced a highly sensitive, deeply disturbing allegation about David's personal life, claiming he acted to keep a dark family secret hidden forever. The medical evidence behind this claim wasn't clear. Different experts looked at the same findings and reached different conclusions. There was no confession, no witness, nothing solid enough to prove it beyond doubt. It didn't need to be solid. It just needed to be horrifying enough that no juror could shake it from their mind. In March of 2006, the second trial ended. David was found guilty again. This time, there was no number of years attached to his sentence. This time, it was life without parole, no release date, no appeal that could simply reduce his time, just a cell until the day he died. Boney was tried separately for the same 3 killings. He was convicted too, 225 years. Even behind bars, Boney couldn't seem to stop talking about that night. He wrote letters. He wrote what he called his own life story, describing details from the case that only someone who had truly been there could have known. None of it matched the version he'd sworn to under oath. It was as if the truth kept leaking out of him in every direction except the courtroom. 2 different men, 2 separate convictions, for the exact same 3 murders, and only one of them had actually done it. David had already survived 1 wrongful conviction. Now, he was losing his freedom again, with no light left at the end of the tunnel. It felt final. It felt like the system had closed the door for good this time. Then one more detail came to light. The prosecutor who led this second conviction, the one who stood in front of the jury and built this highly sensitive, unproven theory from nothing solid, had already signed something before the verdict was even read. A book deal with a real publisher about this very case, about convicting David Camm. He wasn't just trying to win a trial. He'd already agreed to profit from writing the ending of David's story before that ending had even happened. David was sitting in a cell for the rest of his life, and the man who put him there had already picked out the title. In June of 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court did something it almost never does. It threw out David's second conviction too. The judges said it plainly. There was never real evidence that David molested his daughter. None. It should never have reached a jury in the first place. And once the book deal became public, the prosecutor wasn't just criticized in the press. Courts got involved. He fought for months to hang on to the case. But eventually, he was removed from it completely, ruled too compromised to be trusted with it any longer. A special prosecutor stepped in for trial number 3. A man with no history with the case and no stake in the outcome. And by now, the state had already burned through 2 different motives. First, the affairs. Then, the sensitive allegations A.C. Court had just called baseless. So they reached for a third: life insurance money. The theory was simple on paper. Kim had a policy worth a significant amount of money, and prosecutors argued that was reason enough for David to want her gone. But even that motive came with a problem the state couldn't quite explain away. If money was the reason, it never accounted for why 2 young children needed to die alongside her. Boney took the stand again. Same story as before. He sold David a gun. He stood outside. He watched. But this time, something was different. Under cross-examination, Boney couldn't correctly describe David's car. He couldn't correctly describe what David was supposedly wearing that night. Small details, but the kind of small details a man who actually witnessed a murder shouldn't get wrong. His own story had shifted so many times across so many years that even he seemed to be losing track of which version he'd told to which detective. Then came the moment that changed everything. The man whose blood-spatter testimony had helped convict David not once, but twice, took the stand. And this time, he told the truth. He admitted his credentials were fake. He'd claimed for years to be a trained forensic analyst, even claimed advanced academic degrees he never actually had. None of it was real. He admitted he had almost no real background in the field at all. He admitted the conclusions he gave 2 separate juries, under oath, were essentially just guesswork. The exact testimony that started this entire 13-year nightmare had just been demolished by the very man who gave it. Even the story about the garage having been cleaned up fell apart. What investigators once called suspicious wasn't a cleanup at all. It was just blood, doing what blood naturally does after enough time passes in open air. Something ordinary had been read as something sinister, because it fit the story the state wanted to tell. Outside voices had started weighing in on the case too by this point. National forensic scientists reviewing the trial called the original blood analysis unreliable, at best a guess dressed up as certainty. What had once been sold to a jury as unshakable science was starting to look like nothing more than one man's opinion, delivered with confidence. But the state wasn't done losing ground. New DNA testing came back, and this time, it wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't up for debate between competing experts. Boney's own DNA was found directly on Kim's clothing, on both children's clothing, and underneath Kim's broken fingernail. Physical proof of contact Boney had denied from the very first interrogation. The man who claimed he only stood outside and watched had left his own DNA on the people he swore he never touched. At this point, David's defense didn't need to prove he was innocent. They didn't need a theory. They didn't need an alternate suspect. The case the state had built, piece by piece, over 13 years, had simply come apart in front of the jury's eyes. The forensic expert admitted he lied. The star witness couldn't keep his own story straight. And the physical evidence pointed to someone who wasn't David at all. 13 years, 2 convictions. A case that had just fallen apart in open court in front of everyone. And now, one final jury had to decide what came next. 10 hours. That's how long the jury took to decide the rest of David Camm's life. On October 24th, 2013, they came back into the courtroom, not guilty, on all 3 counts. David broke down completely. The same raw, gutted sound from that 911 call 13 years earlier. Except this time, it wasn't horror, it was relief. 13 years is a long time to lose. But the years weren't even the worst part. 3 separate trials meant 3 separate times. David had to sit in a courtroom and relive the exact night his wife and children died, over and over, in front of strangers who held his entire future in their hands. 3 times, he had to listen to lawyers argue over the worst moment of his life, like it was a puzzle to be solved, not a tragedy he actually lived through. Members of that final jury spoke afterward about just how thin the case against David had actually become by the end. Some admitted they had walked into the trial, assuming the state must have something solid, simply because he'd already been convicted twice before. By the time deliberations started, that assumption had completely fallen apart. He walked out that day with his name back. Everything else, he had to rebuild from nothing. He stayed in the same town. He didn't run from it. He went back to ordinary work. He eventually remarried, choosing to build something new instead of disappearing into what he'd lost. And slowly, the state started paying for what it took from him. Not all at once, in pieces, spread out over years. First, $450,000 from the county, years after his release. Then, years later still, $4.6 million more, this time from the state itself. His attorney put the total plainly. Altogether, more than $5 million, just from the settlements that were ever made public. There were other settlements too, ones that were never disclosed, quiet agreements folded into the years after his release. Money doesn't undo 13 years in a cell. It can't give back a childhood, or a marriage, or the version of David's life that got taken the night his family was killed. His own attorney said it best. No amount of money could ever really pay David back for what he lost. But it was the system finally admitting, in the only language it really speaks, that it got this badly wrong. David didn't disappear after that. He took a job with a nonprofit that investigates wrongful convictions, the exact kind of mistake that stole 13 years from him. Now, he spends his time trying to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. He speaks with jurors from his own final trial to this day, some of whom he now considers friends. He shows up for other people trapped in the same kind of nightmare he barely survived, reading through their case files late at night, looking for the same kind of overlooked detail that once took 13 years to surface in his own. But not everyone accepted how this story ended. Kim's own parents never did. Even after the acquittal, even after the DNA, even after the expert admitted his own testimony was fabricated, they've said publicly they still believe David is guilty. For them, no verdict will ever be enough to change their minds. That's a wound the courtroom was never able to close, no matter what the evidence eventually showed. They buried their daughter and their grandchildren once. In their eyes, they never got to see the person responsible held accountable at all. 13 years, 3 trials, and a case that fell apart in open court. And it still couldn't close the wound for everyone it touched. The kind of science that helped convict David in the first place has since been formally criticized by forensic organizations across the country. National reviewers have said outright that this entire field was never built on the kind of solid research it should have been. Courtrooms across the country trusted it anyway for decades, simply because it sounded scientific enough. To this day, legal experts still point to David's case as the clearest example of what happens when a courtroom trusts an expert who was never really an expert at all. The case never really left the national spotlight. Major networks built entire documentary specials around it. Multiple books were written, trying to make sense of how one investigation could go so wrong. Not once, but twice. Film crews and true crime cameras followed the story for over a decade, long after most cases like it had already been forgotten. For David, none of that attention ever really felt like closure. It just meant the worst night of his life kept getting replayed, packaged, and sold, long after the courtroom doors had finally closed for good. David Camm never got his wife back. He never got his son or his daughter back. What he got after everything was his name. But this case leaves us with questions that still don't have easy answers. If 2 separate juries can look at the exact same weak evidence and both come back guilty, how many other people are sitting in a cell right now for something they never did? If the man whose testimony started this entire 13-year nightmare admitted under oath that he made it all up, why did it take 3 trials and 13 years for anyone to actually question him? And if Kim's own parents still believe David is guilty, even after everything the courts eventually proved, is a not guilty verdict ever really enough to give a family closure? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one. If this case had you speechless the way it had us, hit that like button right now. It's the only way this story reaches the people who need to see it. And if you're new here, subscribe. We break down cases like this every single week, the ones the system almost got away with. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.